First of all, let's talk about Matrix Parent Network. What we do is that we empower families of children with special needs to successfully understand and access the systems that serve them. For most of our parents, that would be the special education system and possibly the regional center system. That's most of the work that we do. And what our purpose is that we want you to become successful advocates and role models for your children. So we use a teaching model, which is this. We'd also do individual work with parents. So you could call us. We could do things like review files, maybe go to an IEP meeting. And so that part of it, the teaching, and then that's the modeling part, which we show you how to do it. And then the last part is that you practice. And so we use a pretty typical teaching model with this. Okay, Margaret. Matrix Parent Network is a federal parent training and information center through the Office of Special Education, the U.S. Department of Education. Parent training centers are authorized through the original IDEA in 1975. We're also a California Resource Center, and that's through the California Department of Developmental Services. And we are a family empowerment center through the California Department of Education, and we receive funding from all of these sources. Okay. We are parent advisors and not attorneys or advocates. We do not give legal advice or advise a course of action. We provide support and information to help parents, help parents learn about their rights and options, find referrals and resources, and help parents become the best advocate they can for their child. Okay. Just a little bit about me, and I'll let Margaret introduce herself in just a second. My name is David Pochel, and I've been a parent advisor with Matrix for about 4 years now. In my previous life, I retired 10 years ago as a director of special education for a school district in the Bay Area. And I spent most of my career, though, in Southern California, where I was a teacher for children with emotional disabilities, a coordinator, a special education director, and I also taught evenings at Cal State Northridge for several years while I was a coordinator. My main focus when I was working was on autism and behaviors. So I worked as a certified behaviorist for about 5 years early in my career. And Margaret, do you want to say a couple of things about yourself?
Yeah, I had tried to make myself disappear here. I'm Margaret, and I'm the senior parent advisor at Matrix. I've been here about 12 years. I joined Matrix when my children were in middle school and having a lot of emotional difficulties, and went through many IEPs. And it's been great working for Matrix and trying to help other parents get through some of the same stuff that I went through as a parent.
Great, thanks. Okay. No kidding. There we go. So the goal of this training is to provide you with a basic understanding of positive behavior support theory and to provide you information you will need to understand the components of a behavior intervention plan. So the PBS theory is what the basis of behavior plans are in schools. And we'll go into this a little more, but it's not the philosophy, it's the practice of positive behavior support that's used as the basis for anything that's really done in schools behaviorally these days, and in particular for behavior intervention plans for students with special needs. Okay. Let's look at some typical behaviors, aggression towards others, self-harm, non-compliance, like refusing to do work or listen to directions. That might also include school refusal, eloping, self-stimulation, ritualistic behaviors, and I can't see the last one down there, sorry, and tantrums. So the problem that I have with this list is that when we talk about behaviors, is that these are descriptions of behaviors, but I don't know what aggression towards others look like. So somebody, like in my situation, when I was a teacher working with children with emotional disabilities, aggression could be a physical act of violence, where aggression in a general education classroom could be, somebody throwing a pencil across the room. So what's important in positive behavior support is looking at behaviors, but looking at them from a specific descriptive point of view and not using labels. And so these are typical descriptors, but they're not, again, what the behaviors are. They're just definitions of them. Okay. Um, so let's have a definition for this, and I'll go into this in a minute a little more deeply into this, but a formal definition for PBS could be a set of research-based strategies used to increase quality of life and decrease problem behavior by teaching new skills and making changes in a person's environment. So it's really two pieces. And the first piece has to do with determining it's actually the function of the behavior, which we'll get into in a minute, and teaching a new behavior. So that's one piece. But another big piece of this is actually changing the environment that the child is operating in so that those behaviors aren't encouraged to happen in the first place. So it's really a two-piece definition of what it is. Okay. So before we go into PBS theory, I do want to make one thing clear, and I know that a lot of you probably have children with autism. You have children that maybe have regional center services, and so you're familiar with applied behavior analysis. Um, so those of you that aren't, by going through what we're talking about PBS theory, we're going to talk about ABA, applied behavior analysis, because PBS is a mirror reflection of ABA. And so what's happened in behavior over the last 50 years, starting with B.F. Skinner and doing his operant conditioning experiments, which talked about addiction and talked about making choices, and then work at UCLA in the late 60s with autism, that led to the creation of applied behavior analysis. And so that's a philosophy, that's a practice that takes place in a very small setting, like with maybe one child or a very small group of children. And it's very prescribed, it's it's a very scientifically based way of looking at behaviors and responding to them. And what happened with positive behavior support is that around the late 60s, early 70s, we started getting away from what's called aversive punishments. We stopped doing corporal punishment in schools. We started humanizing more the idea of education. And so what happened is that everybody was looking around, how are we going to look at behaviors in a general education environment or a special education environment where we're not doing this ABA? And what happened is that ABA happened to be something that could be transferred. It could be what I like to call democratized. It was made from this clinical kind of practice into something that could be practiced on a much wider scale. The one thing I have to acknowledge on this before we get into it is that democratization, that transfer of the theory of ABA into positive behavior support has not been perfect. And so if you're a parent that has a child with behavior issues and they have a behavior plan, and that behavior plan looks great because it was possibly created by a certified behaviorist, and what you're finding as a parent, what I'm finding as a parent advisor a lot of times is that there's this real disconnect between what it says on the behavior plan and how it's being implemented in the classroom. And I'm finding this to be a huge problem because we're having these very highly trained behavior analysts. They're called BCBAs, board certified behavior analysts, that have the same skills sets, or not the same skill set, but have the same level of skills as like a school psychologist or a speech and language pathologist. So these are very professional people that are writing very professional behavior plans and then having staff implement them who are not as skilled in the theory of ABA or PBS. So I want to acknowledge right now that this transfer of this into schools is not anywhere close to being perfect yet. And if you're feeling frustrated as a parent by behavior plans or frustrated that the school can't get a handle on your child's behavior, most of it has to do with training and the fact that most school staff do not have the training to be able to do this with fidelity. So that's kind of the elephant in the room that I'm seeing, and I wanted to make that clear. However, what I do want to tell you is that I saw it myself in terms of doing it if you do it with fidelity. And the experience I had as a new teacher is that I went and worked in a school with children with emotional difficulties, a very tough school. And we were doing physical restraints, actual physical restraints, several times per week. And we only had 30 students in the school. So these were, a lot of kids being restrained, physically restrained. And as a staff, after the first year I was there, we got together and decided that we were all going to get highly trained on positive behavior support and crisis intervention. And by implementing this over a period of time and doing with fidelity, those 3 or 4 restraints plus all the other drama that goes along with those things went from happening those several times per week to have happened once in the last year and a half that I was at the school. So I know experientially that this works. I also know from having supervised positive behavior plans over the years that if they're implemented correctly, this stuff actually does really work. And so there's been studies you can look at. There's been literally thousands of studies on this over the years that show that this is a valid methodology. Again, it's implementation. So let's talk about what the theory is. So first of all, PBS says that problem behaviors do not happen in a vacuum. There's almost always a legitimate reason. And when I say almost always, that's like 99.9% of the time. It's very rare that there's not a legitimate reason behind a maladaptive behavior, behind a problem behavior that a child's displaying. The second thing is that behaviors are communication. A child is letting people in their environment know that they have a need and are communicating as best they can. We have to understand about 90% of the children that have special needs that are in special education have a language processing deficit, which means that their understanding of language, their ability to use language, their ability to use things like social skills and appropriate behaviors are not at the same level as a typical child. And so a child with special needs is going to communicate what they need in a different way than a typical child is. And a lot of time those communications are maladaptive or problem behaviors. But because we know their communication, it gives us a place to start looking at what is that child trying to communicate. Okay. So once a reason is determined, and so remember all that the behaviors I was talking about, children display the tantrums and all that stuff, and we have to make very kind of clinical description of what that behavior is. So let's use, for the purposes of this training, let's use a really easy behavior, and we'll use this as an example throughout this. A maladaptive behavior could be as simple as a child not raising their hand when they want to say something in class. And so instead of raising their hand, they're calling out all the time. So what we're doing with that behavior is that we're going to try to determine what the reason for it is. And we describe the behavior when a teacher asks a question of the class. Joe will speak out instead of raising his hand. So that's a description of the behavior. And then we try to figure out what the function of it is. What's the purpose of that? And then once we figure out what the purpose of it is, and we'll get into those in a few minutes, then we could design or create a behavior that meets the same underlying need as the problem, the behavior that the child has been using, and teach them a behavior that works societally. It works like if you're talking about Joe was in a third grade classroom, his behavior then would be Joe would raise his hand as the same rate as a typical student. In other words, a typical student is not going to raise their hand 100% of the time. Once in a while, they're going to call stuff out. And so what we're looking for Joe is not, curing the behavior. We're looking for him to be able to use a new behavior in a way that a typical student would. Okay. And so if you remember, we talked about two pieces of PBS theory, the first of it being teaching behaviors, the other part being environmental changes. And the way you can look at these is that you can look at these environmental things sometimes as triggers for a child. So, for instance, if we're looking for a child, and we'll use, because it's a little different, we won't use Joe in this case, but we're looking at a child that has significant sensory issues, that loud noises are a problem. And so, when this child, there's loud noises or there's confusion in the classroom, that's a trigger for this child. And so, what we try to do to the environment is reduce that kind of background noise, those triggers for a child so that they don't have to react to that. Now, that's kind of an artificial thing to do, but what we do with teaching new behaviors is that we then also teach that child how to stand, how to, maintain themselves in those stressful environments, maybe in a loud environment. So that's also a piece of it. Um, so we also teach coping strategies and skills that are taught to empower a child to reduce the need for the behavior. Uh, a lot of people with autism, a lot of people with speech and language delays, any of these language processing things, because they're not neurotypical. And by the way, anybody that has this language processing uh, they're not deficits, they're language processing disorders only in terms of the environment that they're in. So they have a language processing order in a school environment. However, in work, if they're doing something that they like to do that they're good at, that language processing may be minimized. So you see how this stuff works. Um, that it's considered a deficit in one place, in one you know yeah, in one environment where it's not in another environment. So the coping strategies are, let's say we have a child with autism that uh, I don't know, maybe has issues with well, there's issues with language. And so a person like that is going to be stressed in a meeting that is language based and there's no visuals. And so when they're an adult, they're going to need to have coping strategies that allow them to be able to exist in that kind of uncomfortable environment for them. So we're teaching coping strategies to help with these triggers over time. Okay. Um, so the other thing we need to understand, though, is that some behaviors that are neurologically based may not respond to the teaching of replacement behaviors. So we take a case of a child with a disability, like Margaret, what's the one I'm thinking of with Alyssa that I can't, I'm drawing a blank right now.
I'm pretty.
The Prader-Willi syndrome. I'm sorry. So Prader-Willi syndrome. By the way, when you get old, it's interesting that we old people aren't losing our ability to rationally think or to think critically. What we're losing the ability to remember are nouns. And so the first thing to go in a memory of a person that's older are nouns, but that's not indicative of memory loss. It's simply indicative of nouns not being related to anything concrete. And as you get older, you start relating language more to concrete issues. Anyway, just an aside if I forget things that I'm saying. So I would say Prader-Willi syndrome is an issue that children have. That's a genetic disorder where one of the symptoms is the inability to feel full, to be feel sated by eating. And so these children have appetites that they can't control themselves. So if there's food someplace, they are going to go after the food just because there's a gene involved in this. It's a neurological disorder they simply can't control. So what we have to do for kids like that is that first of all, we have to make the environment safe for them. There can't be food, there can't be, things around that they're going to go after. But we also have to teach them coping strategies. What happens when they're an adult and they walk into an environment, into a grocery store, and they have to buy food? How are they going to control themselves from doing that? How are they going to be able to get that stress level to the point where they're able to function? And so with people with those kind of disabilities, they're not going to learn new behaviors because they just neurologically cannot learn those. So we teach them these coping strategies. We teach everybody the coping strategies because there's pieces of their behaviors that are going to last a lifetime. But in terms of teaching these kind of general coping strategies, that's for these more serious disabilities that don't respond so much to the teaching of new behaviors. Okay. Punishment does not work. I have to say that with um, as a qualifier with that, if you're in applied behavior analysis environment where you're working one-to-one with a child and you have a master's degree or a PhD in applied behavior analysis and you're running a very clinical setting, punishment can work along with reinforcers in some cases. The problem in a school environment is that nobody has a clue how to do punishment in a way that's scientifically valid. And so for all practical purposes of the environments that we're talking about, absolutely punishment does not work. So what can happen with punishment is that it can work for a short period of time. Um, and you can do whatever you want with a child. And what I see happening a lot is that children are just taken out of class and put isolated someplace in the school. that you can punish a child and that will stop that behavior for that period of time. But as soon as that child goes back into the classroom, um, that behavior is going to come back because nothing has been to address the underlying need. And remember that underlying need is a legitimate, it's not a cry for help, it's just a legitimate expression of a communicative intent by that child. So punishment, for one thing, it's just what it does is that it satisfies the need of the punisher for doing something for them having their feelings hurt by the child creating that behavior. And unfortunately, I see that all the time where people take children's behaviors personally, even though they're supposed to be the adult is supposed to be the professional. And so what happens is that they end up punishing, which satisfies their need. It certainly does not uh, satisfy the need of the child. Okay. All right. So we've kind of gone through what the theory of positive behavior support is that we see a behavior that's a maladaptive or a problem behavior. We describe accurately what it is. You don't need to go back, Margaret. That's okay. Um, and then we analyze the reason for it. And then, oh, you know what? Did we go? We haven't gotten to the reasons yet, have we? Maybe that shows up in the BIP section, so we won't go through this yet. So we figure out a reason, then we come up with a replacement behavior, and then, oh, you're in. Oh, okay, go back to one more slide. I'm sorry. That's right. That's where we do this. Okay, I'm sorry. Go to the next slide, Margaret. I'm sorry. This was all here in front of me. Okay. All right. So a BIP, what a BIP is, as I said at the beginning, it's a reflection of positive behavior support. So it takes those things, describing the behavior, coming up with a replacement behavior and so on. And then it also brings in other components of ABA and positive behavior support, which we're going to talk about in relation to being on the behavior plan. So the accurate description of the behavior, we talked about that. We've talked about an analysis of the reason for the behavior. We've talked about the identification of a pro-social replacement behavior. And the next piece, which we haven't talked about, is a plan to encourage or reinforce the replacement behavior. So what happens? So let's go to the next one because I know we're going to get into more detail on all of these. Okay, so we reinforce the behavior, and then we have come up with how are we going to ignore or minimize the old behavior? And that's important, and we'll talk about that in a little while. What to do if the old problem behavior reappears, and I guarantee you the old behavior is going to reoccur. Okay. And how are we going to modify the environment and what coping skills will be taught? So we have some new ideas in here, but it's kind of the same construct of what we talked about with the positive behavior support. Okay. All right. So let's talk about how you intervened with behaviors in a school setting. So the first thing to remember is that what we don't want to do is to over provide services for a child. And the reason for that is that we want them to live, we want them to exist in the most natural environment as they can in school. So we're going to take the behavior level that they're showing and we're going to try to match what our response is to it. And the way that we do that is that we figure out how interfering the child's behavior is to their ability to access their education. So if there's a behavior where a child is displaying, and let me give an example of maybe a child with autism stimming, where they're doing a repetitive ritualistic behavior, and a stim, whatever a stim could be, it's a physics. Everybody knows what a stim is. Um, so if that ritualistic behavior that that child with autism is displaying is not interfering with their ability to access their education. And by the way, that's the standard we always use when we look at special education. What level of services do we need to provide or intervention do we need to provide so that the child has the ability to access their education like a typical child? And by the way, that includes not just academically, that includes any of those activities that go along with school, including like recess and assemblies and dances and proms and sports and all that. That's a typical school thing. But we don't want to um, overdo it. So again, this child with autism is doing that ritualistic behavior. If it bugs somebody else, tough. If it's a problem for that child, then we address it. Okay. All right, Margaret. So the first level would be that we write a goal only. And maybe for our child Joe, the child that wasn't raising his hand, that the goal will be that Joe will raise his hand appropriately 4 out of 5 opportunities. Okay, so when we say appropriately, by the way, remember that definition I gave you before, that what we want Joe to do is to do that behavior, the new behavior, at the same rate as a typical student, not better than a typical student. And I will tell you one thing with behaviors, and you may know this as parents, is that a lot of times when a child has behaviors and they have a behavior plan, people go overboard and expect better behavior from them than they do from general education students. And this is a problem that I see quite frequently in schools. So what we want Joe to do is to perform that behavior like his typical peers. And that may be enough. What that does is that because goals drive what we do in an IEP in terms of services. So what that goal may drive is possibly a behaviorist doing consult with the general education teacher. Here's how you deal with Joe on this goal. So that may be enough for him. However, if the behavior is more interfering, and let's say Joe is at the point where he's raising his hand and he's calling out and he's getting angry when he doesn't get called on, maybe we're going to need then a formal behavior plan. And so a formal behavior plan is usually used when a child is experiencing a behavior that's more interfering than just a goal could address, but you know what the purpose of the behavior is, or you've got a very good idea of what the function, and remember that purpose of the behavior is. And so you don't need to go to the last level, which we'll talk about here in a minute. You can write a behavior plan, put all those components in we talked about, and you have a pretty good idea that it's going to work because you know the purpose of the behavior. Okay. Um, and then if you don't know the purpose of the behavior, or it's a very serious behavior. Let's say we're talking about Joe not only getting angry when he doesn't get called on, but picking his desk up and throwing it across the room. Let's say we're talking about a much more serious behavior. Let's also talk about the fact that maybe we don't know the reason Joe's doing this. That if he just wanted attention, he could have gotten that at a much lower level of escalation, and he maybe was getting that attention. So there must be something else going on. So what we do in that case is that we run, or we do what's called a functional behavior assessment. And what that is that a professional like that BCBA, that board certified behavior analyst, comes into the classroom or observes and does testing of Joe in different environments. And it's usually observational based and interviews, and there's ways that they go about doing this. And what they're doing is that they're coming up with, okay, this is the reason Joe is displaying this serious behavior. And then they're able, based on that, to help create a more analytical behavior plan because they've done all of this, observation and all of this, all of the work that they do, the technical work that they do. So FBAs are appropriate for those behaviors that are complex, very interfering, or whose purpose is not clearly evident. And what I will say that there's even a higher level of of an interventionist, and it's called a functional behavior analysis. And that's only done in a clinical setting, though, because what that does is that actually manipulates things like um, the setting events, all of that, all of the stuff that's going on in the classroom, like the things that trigger a child. They may actually manipulate those, and a child may actually react in a negative way to that. So again, that's one of those things can only be done in a clinical setting. So a functional behavior assessment is as far as we go in analyzing or looking at the functions of behaviors. Okay. Um, okay, so this is kind of what I was speaking about right at the beginning about implementation. A goal or BIP is only a piece of paper if it's not fully implemented. Each component of a BIP must be implemented exactly as it is written if it is to be successful. And here's the rub, is that if you have people that have less training than they need in order to implement this, they're going to make big mistakes, and the mistakes are going to be some basic stuff that they're misinterpreting a behavior that the child's showing, or they're not able to do reinforcement correctly. And what that does is that by not following it, um, that skews any data that you're going to take on the behavior plan because it's not being implemented correctly. What you're doing with the behavior plan is you have this thing that's an outline that needs to be followed the way it's written. And if people aren't following it the way it's written, and then all the behavior becomes skewed. So what I'm seeing frequently in the last, particularly beginning of this year, I don't know why, is we have these beautiful behavior plans that are written by BCBAs, and it's not working at all in the classroom, but when the BCBA is there, it's working fine. The child's making progress. And so I'm going into IEPs where the districts want to put these children in more restrictive settings because the behavior plan is not working in, the general education setting. But it's not the child's fault. It's the fault of the people implementing the behavior plan. And so, for it to be successful, it needs to be done with this fidelity and with this background. Okay, go ahead on to the next one. Um, okay, so yeah, there's some other parts of behavior plans that should always be on it. But what these things are going to be beyond the scope of this training. One thing I do want to make clear, as I think I probably made it clear, is that this is a complicated field. I have a master's degree in special ed with a focus on behavior. I was a practicing behaviorist for 4 years. I oversaw hundreds of behavior plans. I was in hundreds of classrooms. I've trained thousands, literally thousands of people on all of this stuff. I'm still not, if I went into classroom now after, 20 years not having practice, I would be terrible doing this stuff. And so what I want you to keep in mind as parents or if you're professionals is that the best thing we can do with these behavior plans is to try to do them the best way we can and get the most training that we possibly can get with this. But again, you as parents need to monitoring what's going on with these behavior plans, particularly these behavior plans in classrooms in order to make sure that they're being implemented correctly. And you can tell that by the data that people are collecting on these. And I always encourage parents to look at data on what's happening with these behavior plans. And the reason it's so important that this is really the only specialty that transfers directly into a general education or to a typical setting for a child. If you look at what a school psychologist does, they're doing testing and they're maybe doing counseling, but that skill is not being translated where they're asking the general ed teacher to do the skills that they're doing. Same thing with speech and language. That a speech and language pathologist in a clinical setting or in a small group is using techniques and using skills that they developed. A general ed teacher or a special ed teacher doesn't have that skill level to be able to provide that same level of service. And so what we're doing with the behavior plan is that we're taking a BCBA, who is like a school psychologist or speech and language pathologist at the same level, and asking general education staff and paraeducators to implement something at the same level that they're implementing. And it's the only thing in a school setting that we're asking these people to do something that's so technical. And so please keep that in mind when we're looking at this. And this is the number one issue, by the way, behaviors are in schools, without a doubt. It's, well, there's another issue, communication between schools is another huge one. But behaviors are really the primary thing that so many parents deal with. Okay. Okay, so I told you we'd get to the purposes of the behaviors. And in all of this theory in ABA, all the way back into the 60s, these are really the reasons that everybody's come up with that we can agree on that virtually all behaviors fall under one of these categories. And they come under escape or attention or a sensory issue where a child is experiencing sensory input where they're having issues with power and control. um, I add power and control, and I've always added this in my practice. A lot of people don't, and the reason I add power and control is that children with disabilities have less power in their lives than do typical children. They're going to therapy, they're in a special classroom, they have behavior plans, they've got all this stuff going on where their life is impacted more so than a typical child. And so they require more control, more power of their own life in some cases than a typical child would. So I always include that in it. And then tangibles is the last one where a child wants a specific thing, a tangible item. Okay. Um, then we talked about this a minute ago. In order to determine if the behavior plan is working, it is critical that we keep accurate and timely data. Without data, we are a rudderless behavioral ship. This is another issue that I've seen is just endemic in schools is the lack of ability of classroom staff to be able to take organized, objective data instead of non-objective data. That is, it's all the child is doing okay, they're meeting their goal on this one. What you want to see on a behavior plan that's a specific plan for a child with Joe raising his hand, you want to say that the data is that Joe now is raising his hand 3 times out of 5, and he's doing it with these conditions. And so you want to have numbers that go along with these. And a lot of times you don't. You'll find numbers again from the BCBAs, but not from the classroom interventions so much. Okay. Um, okay, so let's talk about prompts. And one of the reasons, and a lot of this, by the way, because this is based on ABA, a lot of this goes back to autism. A lot of this is based on autism, but frankly, autism is a language processing disorder, just like a speech and language delay, just like a learning disability, just like an emotional disturbance. So about 85 or 90% of the students that are in special education fall under this kind of category of being able to respond to positive behavior support in the way they have to, because of so many of the children we deal with have language processing issues. It's the vast majority of kids that we work with. The reason we use prompting is a way of reminding a child of what they need to do, is that people with autism don't learn observationally usually. If you look at a child going into kindergarten for the first time, that most of the kids see the teacher saying, go take your backpacks over to your cubby and put your backpacks away, and then we sit in our chairs. The child with autism is going to be standing there having no clue what to do. And so they're not going to respond to that observational stuff. And they're also not going to respond to the auditory prompts because they don't learn auditory. They learn usually visually. So we use prompts with children with autism, and they can take any kind of a form. And it's usually part of a behavior plan. So a prompt could be with a small child, maybe a tap on the shoulder. It could be a physical prompt like that. By the way, physical prompts are inappropriate for children over, for me, it was over first or second grade. I never used physical prompts unless it was a child with a very, very involved disability that couldn't communicate another way. But a prompt could be a visual prompt. It could be a sign on the student's desk, do this when this happens. It could be somebody saying something. It could be a clue in the environment where this happens, this is a prompt for you. Um, excuse me. So the idea of using prompting is that we use it until the behavior comes natural for the child, and then we fade it as soon as we can. And you'll see this a lot of this stuff is that anytime we intervene with a child and do something that's unnatural, we try to get in there, teach the skill, and then get out as soon as we can because we don't want them to become, like in this case, to become prompt dependent. We don't want them to depend on that happening all the time. Okay.
David, someone has asked the question, what does it mean to fade?
Ah, thank you. Oh, God, thank you. I forget that yeah. Um, so what fading is that we have a child that needs a prompt 100% of the time to begin with. And our idea is that we want to teach them so we can eventually not use that prompt. And fading is that process where we stop using the prompt. And what it is that, let's say data, when Joe starts raising his hand 1 time out of 5, let's say he was doing 0 times, then we feel, okay, maybe we can not say, hey, Joe, if that's the prompt that we're using, every time we can do it 4 times out of 5. And then when he starts raising his hand, 2 times out of 5, then we may want to back off in the prompt a little bit more. So fading means gradually taking away the support that we're providing. Oh, it's right here. Thank you, Margaret. Is that the next slide? Margaret, was that the next slide? Oh, I see. Where are we now? Are you there, Margaret?
Okay, I had muted myself. Yeah, that was the next slide. And
Okay, so let's go. Okay, let's go back to that, back to the fading one then, one more time. I didn't realize it was the next slide. There we go. Okay, That's funny that question came up. It's a really good question. So it just means removing support as the child learns and practices the replacement behavior consistently. And again, anything that we do with the child, we want to start backing off on that support as soon as we can. Okay. Um, all right, and there's some, again, those are things that are always in the plan. Now, we're going to talk about some other important concepts that you won't see on a behavior plan, but they're things you have to keep in mind because they're critical to the development of them and also the implementation. All right. Okay. All BIP should be strength-based. This means that every child has strengths as well as needs. By focusing effort on incorporating strengths, we can teach a child how to transfer those strengths to other skills. By the way, this is not a platitude. This is a critical piece of what we do. Let me give you an example of something I saw just yesterday. I was reading a file and I saw that a child had this um, real problems in school. Child with autism, high school, got diagnosed a couple of years ago, refusing to go to school, failing classes. And then I start reading the report, and this child has what's called visual spatial skills, meaning that this kid can look at a diagram or look at a blueprint and go, oh, that's there, that's there, that's there. Brilliant. I mean, like 140 IQ in this skill. Schools aren't visually based, and so this child is suffering in school. But if we can develop a behavior plan that incorporates this child's literally brilliance, then we can base a behavior plan based on her brilliance and not on the issues that she's experiencing, which are all in her weak areas. So this idea of having being based strength is again, I see it as a platitude a lot of time. A lot of districts will start by let's talk about the student's strengths, and the teacher talks about how great the student's going, and it's like, oh, they're not talking about their real strengths. They're talking about this, kind of platitude stuff, which bugs me. So their real strengths are critical in having a behavior plans. Okay. Successful BIPs need a team. One person is not responsible for implementing a BIP. Everyone who comes in regular daily contact with a child should be aware of the BIP and know how to consistently follow it. Um, there's programs now in school, and I actually set one of these up in a school district when I was a different director in a different department. And they're called Positive Behavior and Intervention Support, PBIS. And these are school-wide and district-wide and even statewide in a couple of states, positive behavior support programs that cover everybody in a school. So the idea is that you don't just train the teachers, you train the paraeducators, you train the office staff, you train the custodian, you train the people that are in the cafeteria, that they know how to talk to a child, and not just kids with special needs, every child in that school, that everybody has the same language that they're using. And so it's important with even a behavior plan, if they're not practicing that school wide, is that everybody on campus knows how to deal with this child. Example, you have a child that say elopes, child that runs away, and they go to a certain spot in the school and that's their safe place. And staff knows that they're there, they're following them, they're going to go make sure that they're okay. But the custodian doesn't know that this child has a safe place, and they see this child, wherever, and say, hey, you got to get out of there. You don't belong there. What do you think's going to happen to that child that's just been challenged and that's their safe place? That person needs to know that this child has a behavior plan and that is their safe place to go. It could be very damaging otherwise. So I always uh, caution a team that everybody that's dealing with the child needs to be trained. Okay. There is no one size fits all BIP. This is true in special education generally. Every person is different. Every BIP needs to be individually tailored to the child. And again, I can't overemphasize this in my experience and having done this, literally hundreds of times and been involved deeply hundreds of times with these plans. I've never seen a child the same. It's just amazing that, you do the same thing to two different kids that it worked with this child. It doesn't work with this child. And it's like, human behavior is just, it's an incredibly, you know, complicated area that we just don't understand. And so, we're reacting to this child, and so we're not trying to fit them into a behavior plan. We're trying to fit a program to meet them, not the other way around. This is true in special ed, by the way, just generally. there's no stop one size fits all. A long time in my office, I had a banner over the top of my office door, and it said, "It all depends." And so, anytime anyone asks me a question, I said, "I don't know. It all depends on what the issue, what the situation is." It's truly the case in special ed. Okay. Um, so let's talk about independence and self-advocacy and the reason for this. With kids with autism, it's really that balance of allowing them to be who they are, but having enough support so that they can function where they need to function. And that's something that we all struggle with. So it's a difficult situation, but that's the reason we do it is independence. Okay, a child is not responsible for their behavior intervention plan. A parent is also not responsible for it. As PBS is about teaching, we should treat BIPs in the same way as any other skills acquisition. Students do not teach themselves math or reading. There has to be a strong component of instruction and behaviors. Again, this is not natural stuff for them. They have to be explicitly taught how to do this. Okay. Children do not behave in exactly the way a BIP envisions right away. It's critical to reinforce and celebrate partial success. If a child is to be perfect, they and we will always be disappointed. So behaviors don't go away right away. There's a process to this that takes time. Um, what's and I'm not sure, yeah, okay, approximate. And so what I like to talk about is approximating success. Joe raising his hand. He's gotten to the point where he's not raising his hand very often, but one time he goes raise his hand and go hi teacher, and he did it at the same time. That's a huge success for this child, and so that one we want to reinforce a lot, and so that's approximating success. We don't want kids to go from having these really interfering behaviors to having perfect behavior and not get any kind of, good stuff in between. And the reason for that is that our children with disabilities, they have to internally feel what the behavior is that they're trying to show, what they're trying to be taught. They can't just know it in their minds. It has to be a gut feeling. Oh, that's what that behavior, that's what I do in this circumstance. And then they do it because it becomes their preferred way of doing it. So, okay. Behavior spikes. Um, this is something that's in the literature, and it goes all the way back to the beginning of ABA. If a behavior analysis is correct in identifying the reason for a behavior, there will always, or almost always, and I think it's pretty much always, be what is called a behavior spike or a series of spikes. It's also called extinction burst, and that's the term that's used most these days. That's the more technical term. So it's either behavior spike or extinction burst. And what it is that it's an intense um, reappearance of the behavior that we're trying to lose. So Joe raising his hand, he just stops raising his hand completely. He's out of his seat, and he's really escalated. That's going to happen if a behavior plan has the right reason for it. What you'll find if a behavior plan doesn't have the right function, the right reason, is that the behavior will just kind of stay the same. It doesn't get any better, but it doesn't get any worse. So we know as practitioners when we see this behavior spike, oh, we're on the right track. And so what you need to do at that time, and all of these times when you start seeing these behaviors reoccur, you need to keep the faith. You need to keep implementing the behavior plan, implementing the behavior plan. It's important that any changes in the plan be thought out, analyzed, and agreed to by everybody before it's changed. Okay. And this is, you don't need to, actually remember this one, but this is what we use in behavior all the time. And what we use is this ABC. And what we look for is, first of all, the antecedent. What's happening before the behavior occurs? And we talked about those environmental issues, like the child that has sensory issues, that the noise is too loud. That's an antecedent. So an antecedent is anything that precedes a behavior. And then the behavior is what occurs. That's Joe not raising his hand or the child with autism, self-stimming or whatever. And then the third part of it is the consequence. And in behavior, we do not look at consequence in a punishment-based way. Remember, we don't use punishment at all. A consequence is simply what happens as a result of the behavior. So, for instance, with Joe, the antecedent could be that the teacher asks a question. Okay, that's the antecedent that usually sets Joe up. Joe raises his hand. The teacher answers, questions Joe or says, answer the question. Joe answers it. The consequence is that Joe gets a reinforcer, whatever his reinforcement is. That's a consequence. Usually, a consequence if a child does not do the behavior is that there's simply a lack of a reinforcer. So again, we don't use punishment. We don't take anything away. We simply withhold the reinforcement that the child would normally get. So it becomes a natural consequence. We want to make things as natural as we can. What happens in life if you don't have your job this week? You don't get paid. If you don't do this, you don't get your reinforcement. There's no punishment. It's your choice. And the reason this is important is that it puts the power in the child's hands instead of the power of the practitioners. You always want to give the child a choice. You have this choice, you can do this, or you can't, or you don't have to do this. The only consequence for you is that you don't get the reinforcer you would do by getting it, but it's totally cool. And so that way the child feels, remember that power and control I talk about? That's their power. They can say, I don't feel like doing that right now. Okay, that's cool. You don't feel like doing it. That's totally fine. That's your decision. That's okay. Okay, let's go on. Consistency between home and school. And I talked about this before. The other issue, besides behaviors at school being the big one, is communication between school and home. And that one is making me a little bit crazy at this point because I'm finding, again, I don't know if it's my age and I just don't tolerate it as well, but I'm finding that IEP teams and schools don't want to communicate with parents to any degree. Um, you have to know what's going on. You've got to know what's going on. There has to be some communication where, particularly with these behaviors, um, you get home and you have no idea that your child had a blowout at school and nobody tells you. And so you have this stressed child coming home and they're showing stress at home and you have no idea what's going on. The other piece of this is that in my opinion, particularly with neurodivergent people, is that they need a safe place to go after school or a safe place to go after work. And so if you know that your child had a hard day at school and they're coming home, you could make that a safer place for them. You could, that has to be their kind of oasis from the stress that they feel at school. By the way, I believe in this for everything with kids that are neurodivergent. That I don't believe in homework for them in most cases because they need that space away from school. I don't believe in having kids punished for not doing their homework when they get back to school. So a lot of those things that have to do with keeping school at school, I think, is important for a lot of our kids. Okay. Importance of patience. There will be setbacks. Keep following the plan and only institute changes when the data demands it. I talked about that before. And all the adults in the child's life know what the changes are, why they are occurring, and how to implement them. So somebody's not going to change a behavior plan in the classroom without telling anybody else because that changes everything. You can't take data. You can't, get a sense of what's going on. Um, so and one thing else I'll mention in terms of long-term patients with this, when I was working as a coordinator, I was a secondary coordinator, so I had families from sixth grade to adults, and I worked very closely because of the nature of the district we were in with the elementary coordinators. So I'd be going down observing children as early as third and fourth grade that I knew were going to be in sixth grade in a couple of years, because the lawyers were at the meetings and we really had to make sure that we were doing really good programming. Um, so what I did see a lot of times is that I'd see, kids' behaviors in third grade and fourth grade that were, eloping from the classroom and, hitting people and throwing things. And I saw them in high school, that same child, and those things are gone. And even though there were setbacks throughout those years, this child, because of a consistent program and because of maturity, that they're just going to grow out a lot of these things a lot of times. And by learning, alternatives to this behavior over time, it starts to sink in. So let's just go back over the elements of good BIP. An accurate description of the behavior. We talked about that it's not a tantrum, it's a description of what the tantrum looks like. An analysis of the reason for the behavior, that it's attention, escape, sensory, tangible, or power to control. Identification of a pro-social replacement behavior, something that they can do that won't get them in trouble or it will make them fit in more with their typical peers. A plan to encourage or reinforce the replacement behavior, We want to make sure that we're giving them real feedback, not negative feedback, when they do the behavior. The reason we do that, again, is that they have to internalize what that behavior feels like. And if you're punishing, it's going to mix the whole thing up. They're going to get all these mixed signals. If you're reinforcing for the behavior you want to see, the child will eventually internalize that behavior. Okay. Instructions on how to ignore or minimize the old problem behavior. I didn't really go into this, but the reason that's important is that what we don't want to do is reinforce the old behavior. Joe doesn't raise his hand. When he doesn't raise his hand and we say, Joe, go to the office for not raising your hand and talk to Mr. Whatever, Joe's just got a load of attention if that's what the reason for his behavior is. And so we've kind of, gone back on the skills that we're teaching him because we just blew it by giving him attention because we didn't try to ignore that behavior. So there's ways that you do that. It's pretty technical, but there's ways that we can actively ignore or minimize a behavior. What do we do when the old problem behavior reappears? So if there's a violent behavior, what do? We have to have a plan to deal with that. If it's a lower level behavior, what do we do? But the old behavior is going to come back. And what we want to do is we want to minimize it as much as we can, give it as little power as possible, because that's the behavior that we're trying to get rid of. We don't want to keep going back to it. And how the environment will be modified and what coping skills will be taught. So that those two pieces, modifying the environment and especially teaching kids coping skills so that they can use those for their lifetime. How to talk so schools will listen and listen so schools will talk. Acknowledge and process your emotions. By the way, you as a parent, if you're not a professional, you have the right to be emotional. It's okay to be emotional in an IEP meeting. You're not a professional. You're not expected to have that same level of distance from your case. So I never have a problem with parents being emotional in a meeting. It's okay. Focus on your child's needs. I will tell you that's important because if you start talking about your needs, it becomes muddled and it becomes difficult. Focus on what's going on with your child. Listen and ask questions, repeat, reflect, and rephrase for clarifications. Um, do ask questions. If you don't understand, ask. One thing I do advise in an IEP meeting, I don't advise unless it's something very simple, signing an IEP at an IEP meeting. I almost always suggest taking it home and making sure you're comfortable with it before you sign. So again, a lot of that time in the meetings you can be using for understanding what's going on and not trying to figure out if you agree with everything or not. Build on small agreements. Um, with that, I found particularly with behaviors, if you can get a training session for an instructional assistant or a new instructional assistant that has a certain skill set, you can get with your child. Those could be big things. And so you can get small things done that seem small, but they could be, really build on for the future. Use humor and be appreciative and show respect. Um, yeah, I mean, that's just, kind of the golden rule. Um, be grateful and assume your IEP team is doing the best they can. I say this, but at the same time, acknowledge reality. So if you're, do be grateful, but if somebody's telling you something that doesn't look like your child, if somebody is, uh, if somebody is describing your child, that just doesn't sound like, ask. So that doesn't sound like my child. Where is this coming from? Where is this data coming from? Ask those kind of questions because you want to know. You can't see what's happening in school all day. You want to know as much as you can about what your child's affect and how they're being affected at school. So it's fine to ask those pointed questions. They're not, insulting to anyone. You're trying to get information. That's okay. All right. Begin conflict resolution at the lowest level. This is very important. And I will tell you as uh, being an ex-director that if I had a parent that got a hold of me from a school, I would always say, please speak with your case manager. And then they would speak with the principal and come up. And the reason for that is that it's like the gossip game between the time that the parent is at the school level talking to staff there and then gets to me and I don't have any information in between, the issue is not the same. And so to do it sequentially is really important because first of all, things can be settled at a lower level, which is good. Secondly, the information is not going to be accurately relayed, and you're not going to be satisfied. But with that said, I say go as high as you need to go. And so there were many times that was a director of a fairly large school district. I met with individual parents and listened to what they had to say. I would not meet with them. That's totally fine. That was part of my job. And that's true with the superintendent or the assistant superintendent. Any of these people are answerable to parents in the long run. Okay. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation.